Yeah, this video is about WCW. I'm gonna talk a little bit about WCW. WCW, first off, a little bit of background. WCW started off as Georgia Championship Wrestling. In the 1970s, when cable was in its infancy, Georgia Championship Wrestling began airing on the Superstation, TBS. And the ratings were tremendous. They helped launch TBS into the Superstation. Um, area was the organization was run by Jim Barnett and Ole Anderson. It had several stockholders, including both of the Briscoe brothers, who were big acts in the territory. But in 1984, when Vince McMahon was going national, they approached Barnett and the Briscoes about selling the territory. They were all down to sell the territory, and the territory as well as the time slot to to Vince McMahon. Ole Anderson was not down for that. Ole Anderson resents Vince McMahon to this day for buying him out in his deal in Georgia. But they sold the territory, and Vince McMahon appeared on Turner Broadcasting in 1984, and this is widely known among wrestling fans as Black Saturday because it was so horrible. Southern wrestling fans, they did not at all care for the WWF's product, the cartoony, foolishness that the WWF was putting on in the 1980s. So they just rejected it. Meanwhile, another promoter, another promotion, the Mid Atlantic Territory, was based out of the Carolinas. The Mid Atlantic Territory was founded in the 1950s. Like most wrestling territories, it's founded by Jim Crockett Sr. and it was a prominent tag team territory. It featured several prominent tag team wrestlers like the Kentuckians, which was Grizzly Smith, the father of Jake the Snake Roberts, and the father of Nick Patrick, the masked assassin Jody Hamilton. Also featured George Becker and Johnny Weaver, and these were mainstays in the area, a tag team. But in the 1970s, they hired a new booker, George Scott. George Scott, what he did was he brought in several new stars, including Wahoo McDaniel, Ric Flair. He brought a lot of stars from the AWA. Wahoo McDaniel, Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Johnny Valentine, who became a big star in the area also. The Iron Sheik, Roddy Piper, all these stars. And Jim Crockett did tremendous business in this area in the late 70s. The late 70s. When George Scott left and Jim Crockett Jr. took over after the death of his father, Jim Crockett Jr. needed somebody to run the creative, so he reached out to Dusty Rhodes, who was already booking at that point down in Florida. So Dusty made the move, came down to the Carolinas, and around the same time, Ted Turner was begging to get Vince McMahon off his network because Vince McMahon, like I said, his product bombed. So he decided to sell the promotion to Jim Crockett and use the money to finance the first WrestleMania. With the new national exposure, Jim Crockett, they did pretty good. They had, tremendous business in the 80s also. Four Horsemen, the Midnight Express, the Rock and Roll Express, Nikita Koloff, Ivan Koloff, Sting, all these guys, it was a run, and Dusty's creativity peaked in this era. He invented the great pay-per-views like the Great American Bash and pay-per-views like match pay-per-views like Starrcade, matches like the War Games. He was the top babyface also in the company, feuding legendary feuds with Ric Flair in the late '80s, and all the members of the Four Horsemen, really. But in 1988, Jim Crockett bought out Bill Watts' UWF territory after the oil bust, and this transaction really cost Jim Crockett heavily because he went bankrupt. And what happened after that was Ted Turner, he enjoyed the ratings and he didn't want to see wrestling go away. So in 1988, he bought himself the company, Ted Turner. But the problem was, Turner was so busy running other parts of his media empire, he didn't have time to focus on professional wrestling. So he hired an idiot, Jim Herd, who ran a Pizza Hut or some shit like that. And Herd ran the company for a while. And he also ran Ric Flair out of town. Ric Flair got so pissed at Jim Herd's booking decisions that he left a company that he had been with since 1974. So he went to the WWF and he brought the WCW World Title with him. He called himself the Real World Champion. That hurt WCW tremendously. They got back Dusty Rhodes in 1991. They had fired Dusty in 1989 due to an incident where he bladed on national TV. He wasn't supposed to do that. After Jim Hart's firing, WCW went through several changes. Kip Fry, Bill Watts, nobody was seeming to work to boost ratings in any sort of way. So finally, a young executive who they hired after the AWA folded, Eric Bischoff, stepped in. And he was a wrestling guy because he'd been in the AWA and he grew up a wrestling fan, but he wasn't a wrestling guy in the sense that he'd never been a wrestler. So he was, best of both worlds in Turner's mind. So Bischoff starts in 1993. First thing he does is, clear out the roster. He starts bringing in a bunch of guys from the 80s in the WWF, like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage. Through Ric Flair, through the connection of Ric Flair, he brings in Hogan, Randy Savage. And then they bring in, Big Boss Man, Hacksaw Jim Duggan, the whole roster of the 80s WWF. And also he starts bringing in international stars from Japan and Mexico, guys like Eddie Guerrero, guys like Chris Jericho, guys like Chris Benoit, and, having these amazing matches. And in 1995, he decides to go head-to-head with WWE's program, Monday Night Raw, with his own version, Monday Night Nitro. But unlike Monday Night Raw, he would feature highly competitive matches, whereas Raw would generally feature one match and then a bunch of squash matches. So he really started beating Vince in the ratings. 82 weeks in a row, WCW Monday Nitro beat WWE Raw. And he had novel concepts like the NWO, and the NWO was a ratings juggernaut, and just crazy. He ran the road for 2 years. But after a while, the NWO got too big for its own good and just failed. And his failure to push any stars really burnt him out by 1998. And by 1999, he was fired and replaced by two writers from WWE, Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara. Now, Russo and Ferrara, they were horrible. They did some horrible, stupid shit like make David Arquette the WCW champion. And fans just shitted on it and they hated it, and it was terrible, And it wasn't too long after that, in 2001, in a simulcast between Raw and Nitro, that Vince McMahon got on national TV and said, "Look, I've purchased WCW," and that was the end of WCW. They did an invasion angle in 2001, but they were without the one of the problems that the invasion angle failed was because they didn't have the big name WCW stars like Ric Flair, like Hulk Hogan, like the NWO. So Survivor Series Net 2001, that was the Team WWF beat Team Alliance, and that was the end of WCW, and hasn't been heard from since. They've re-released several DVDs concerning WCW, but that's about it.